If you've been watching darker things with feelings that brings you deep down. What's the stirring events? Personalities. True crime. Let's see.
Texas suburbs have a way of clinging to you. If you've ever lived through July in Central Texas, you know it isn't just heat, it's atmosphere. The air itself seems to thicken, heavy with humidity and the smell of cut grass. Barbecue smoke. Hot asphalt. By the evening hours, the sun hangs stubbornly in the sky, dragging out twilight like it refuses to admit that the day is done. For teenagers in Waco in 1982, those long evenings meant freedom from school, from chores, from parents. It meant piling into cars, rolling down the windows, and heading out to Lake Waco. Now, the lake wasn't just water and shore. It was the town's social commons. Couples went there to make out in foreign cars. Friends gathered to drink cheap beer and play radios too loud. Fishermen tried their luck near the piers, while kids drove into the murky green water just to cool off. It was a place where life felt safe and predictable. Parents didn't worry if their kids said they were heading into the lake. It was practically a rite of passage. Now, on the night of July 13th, 1982, three teenagers did exactly that. Kenneth Franks, 18, tall, easily smiling and kind-hearted, drove his car towards Spiegelville Park on the lake's western side. Side was his girlfriend, Jill Montgomery, just 17 with her intelligence and ambition shining in everything she did. Jill brought around her best friend, Rayleigh Rice, also 17. Quieter, softer spoken, but loyal to cool. In the middle of the summer break, they weren't rebels or troublemakers. They weren't sneaking into bars or kicking fights. They were simply out enjoying the night, breathing in the illusion that life was wide open, endless. But what should have been a forgettable summer eve, another drive to the lake, another night of talking and laughing, turned into something unspeakable. The next morning, July 14th, Waco police were summoned to one of the most brutal crime scenes his city had ever seen. Three teenagers were discovered and murdered near the lake, bound, gagged, stabbed repeatedly. Jill had been assaulted. Their throats were slashed. The sound was beyond anything the responding officers expected. The discovery sent a shockwave through Waco. To the detective standing at the scene, it was clear that this wasn't some random accident or robbery caught wrong. This was rage, violence with a purpose. Whoever did this had just wanted them dead. They had wanted them silenced, humiliated, tortured. News traveled quickly. Parents who had always thought of Lake Waco as harmless suddenly forbid their kids to go there. Teenagers who normally lived at the lake after dark stayed home. The idea that three kids could be murdered so brutally in a public park was more than terrifying, felt like an attack on the city's very sense of safety. The crime scene itself offered almost nothing useful. The bindings were crude, strips of cloth, torn, makeshift, no fingerprints, no murder weapon left behind. The stabbings were savage beyond. If the killer or killers had left any wells, they were very confusion. This was 1982. No DNA testing versus science wasn't as sharp-bladed as today, more like a one stick. Detectives, blood and Ferris, violence, fingerprints without it. And the Lake Waco didn't give them much of any of it. Still, the public wanted answers. The newspapers wanted headlines. The families wanted justice. And the police, staring at a crimes, it screamed for a precision. Felt the weight of expectation pressing down. They needed a suspect. They needed a story. Needed. Quickly. But when pressure mixes with a lack of evidence, justice doesn't always come out of the oven golden brown. Sometimes it comes out half-baked. Or in the case of the Lake Waco, charred, collapsed, and barely recognized. The murders themselves were already a tragedy, but the investigation that followed, messy, rushed, filled with questionable choices. turned the Lake Waco case into one of Texas's most infamous examples of justice gone wrong. Before we get lost in suspects and trials, I want to sit with who this story is really about. Because the Lake Waco Murders didn't start with rumors or botched investigations. They started with three kids who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. Kenneth Prince was 18, technically an adult on paper, but let's be honest, 18 still feels like halfway between boyhood and manhood. He was tall, had an easy smile, and people liked being around him. He wasn't one of those kids who could trouble like a Mac. Instead, he had a reputation for being dependable. You needed a ride. Kenneth was the kind of guy who showed up. If you wanted to laugh, he could lighten the mood. Wasn't a star athlete or a class clown. He was simply solid, steady, friendly. When people remembered Kenneth later, what they came back to was his kindness. Wasn't a fucker. Wasn't trying to push boundaries. He was a teenager who liked spending time with his girlfriend and his friends. And driving out to the lake on a summer evening was about as normal as it got. And yet, clueless irony. His normalcy became his vulnerability. Wasn't out looking for them. He was just with people. He cared of them. Oh, Joe Montgomery was beside Kentucky. But Joe was 17. Right in that strange, fragile, exciting place of almost adult. She was smart, not just in the way of getting good grades. Well, she did, but in the way that suggested ambition. She had plans, dreams, visions of what her life could do beyond the boundaries of Waco. Maybe college, maybe a career, maybe thrive. Well, Jill wasn't content to just go with the flow. She carried herself with energy of someone who believed life could be more, but she believed she deserved more. And she wasn't selfish with the ambition either. She had a loyalty to her friends. That meant she wanted to bring people along with her, not leave them behind. Her family and friends described her as vibrant, someone who would walk into a room and make it brighter. She had an openness that drew people in. Kenneth was drawn to that, of course. So was her best friend, Raylene Rutz. She was also 17, Joe's closest friend. And while Jill might have been the dreamer, the one looking outward at horizons, Raylene was the quieter presence, the steadier one. Every friendship group has someone like this. The person who doesn't need to be the loudest, who isn't chasing attention, but who matters, because they're the one you can trust with your secrets. Raylene was gentle, sweet, a girl people remembered as kind-hearted, soft-spoken, wasn't out to break rules or test limits. She trusted Jill, went where Jill went, and that night at the lake was no different. She came along not because she was chasing some grand adventure, but because that's what friends do. If Jill represented light, and Kenneth represented Raylene was the quiet harmony between them. Together, the three of them were just teenagers, ordinary kids, in important Texas summer. And here's the part that makes this case hit harder than just the mentality wrong. These three weren't just names in a bed. They weren't just statistics in a murder file. They were future. Kenneth might have gone on to build a career, maybe raise a family, maybe still be in Waco today. Jill might have chased her dreams beyond Texas, maybe become the first in her family to graduate college, maybe inspire others with her determination. And Raylene might have continued to be that steady, dependable person everyone could count on, building a quiet life filled with loyalty, but because the brutality of those friends, we'll never know. That's what was stolen, unspeakable. Mark that night. Not just 3 lives, but 3 lifetimes. Decades, birth, graduations, first apartments, first jobs. Children of their own, all erased, in a single knotted bun. Why this matters? I emphasize this because when we move into the investigation, the suspects, which fight, and the mess that follows, it's easy to lose sight of this. The justice system tends to reduce people into labels. Sus, defendant, convict. But the human heart doesn't work. When you look at their photographs, Red, Jill's bright eyes, Raylene's gentle smile, you realize these weren't just three fits. God, murder. These were people who should have had 40, 50, 60 more years at it. And that's the true horror of this story. Private Salt was sad, yes, but the loss was deeper. Families didn't just bury teenagers, they buried kids. They buried the maybes and could have been. And that grief, unlike evidence in a file. So before we turn to detectives and suspects and forward dramas, remember this. The center of the Lake Waco Murders were Janet, Jill, Raylene. Three young love, three empty chairs at family tables. Three futures, hot, short, and sad. As we'll see, their story didn't just end with their deaths. It was dragged, weird, questionable prosecutions, appeals and debates about justice. While the state said it bound their killers, in this far murky and forbidden, Lord. If the scene at Spiegelville Park looked like something out of a nightmare, that's because it was. Detectives arriving on the morning of July 14th were met with chaos frozen in time. Three teenagers, bound and gagged, lay where the night had ended for them. The bindings weren't sophisticated. Not ropes or handcuffs, but strips of cloth, torn fabric, makeshift restraints. Whoever did this hadn't walked in with a professional kit. They used what they had or what they found. Now, the stabbings were savage, messy, frenzied. The wounds suggested more than a simple intent to kill. There was rage in them, fury, the kind of violence that doesn't stop after the victim is down, but continues until exhaustion sets in. Jill Montgomery bore additional horror. She had been sexually assaulted. For investigators, that detail suggested motive, though it would be one of the few pieces of evidence that might have offered real forensic leads. But here's the problem. This was 1982. If you're used to crime shows today where DNA gets processed in under an hour, or fingerprints pop up hastily on a glowing screen, let me burst that bubble. In the early 80s, forensic science was closer to guesswork than CSI. Police had four main tools: fingerprints, blood typing, hair and fiber analysis, and witness statements. Well, that was it. DNA analysis wouldn't exist for years. Even in cases where biological material was collected, there was no way to link it definitively to a suspect. At best, you could say, this color is consistent with someone who has brown hair, or this blood is type O positive, which is, half the population. Not exactly a smoking gun. Now, at Spiegelville, evidence was thin. There were no usable fingerprints. The findings were too generic. Anyone could have torn cloth. The night ones revealed brutality, but no clear signature. And the sexual assault, while horrifying, couldn't be analyzed in a way that would conclusively tie it to anyone. Today, DNA might have cracked the case in days, but back then, it left investigators with nothing more than grim details and a lot of pressure. And the pressure was enormous. This wasn't a case police quietly worked in the background. Three teenagers murdered in a public park was front-page news. Parents were terrified. Borders swarmed, and the community demanded a result. The police needed to give them something, a suspect, an arrest, reassurance that the monsters responsible weren't lurking out there ready to strike again. But here's where things start to tilt. Because instead of admitting they didn't have much, investigators leaned on what I'll politely call creative strategy. Politely, they leaned on rumors, jailhouse snitches, and gut feelings dressed up as evidence. For example, rather than building a case around hard science, they built it around who people said might have done it. If you were in jail and wanted some leniency, all you had to do was drop a name, claim you heard someone bragging about the murders, and boom, you were suddenly useful. And never mind that jailhouse informants are about as trustworthy as a used car salesman, tell you the pizza you're about to find was only driven to church on Sunday. Oh, even the way the crime scene was handled raised eyebrows. Detectives documented the scene, yes, but not with meticulous care we'd expect today. Chain of custody on evidence wasn't airtight. Leads weren't always followed consistently. In some ways, it feels like the brutality of the crime shocked them so badly that they jumped straight past analysis. Desperation. Now, to be fair, we are talking about 1982. Small city police departments didn't have the resources of the FBI. They didn't have labs filled with cutting-edge technology. But still, the mistakes, the shortcuts, the reliance on questionable testimony would come back to haunt this case again and again. And that's the thing with the Lake Waco murders. The horror wasn't just what happened that night at the lake. It's what happened after, in courtrooms, in appeals, and in the way the evidence was twisted to fit a narrative rather than the truth. Now, at the scene, 3 young lives had been ended in violence. But as the investigation unfolded, what also began dying, piece by piece by piece, was the integrity of the justice system that was supposed to protect. When 3 kids were murdered in a public park, bound and gagged, stabbed, and left behind like discarded objects, the pressure to find the killers is immense. And in Waco, that pressure quickly shifted from solve the crime to find someone to blame. The difference might sound small, but it's everything. The crime scene hadn't given investigators much. No clean fingerprints, no weapon, no eyewitnesses who actually saw the murders. What they had was community fear and reporters breathing down their necks. When you've got nothing but fear at headlines, you start looking for easy answers. Enter David Wayne Spence. The first name that started circling around was David Wayne Spence. However, if you're picturing a criminal mastermind, erase that image right now. David was a 27-year-old with a bad reputation in Waco. The kind of guy police already knew, not because he was violent, but because he made bad choices and had a rap sheet filled with small-time trouble. Petty crimes, drug use, fighting. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't known for anything like what happened at Lake Waco. What made him attractive to police was simple. He was easy. Spence fit the mold of someone the community could believe capable of violence. He was poor, he was rough around the edges, and he didn't have a lot of people willing to stand up for him. In other words, he was convenient. And in an investigation like this, convenience sometimes trumps evidence. The Melendez brothers. Now here's a duo. Alongside Spence, police pulled in Gilbert and Anthony, or Tony Melendez. The brothers had a history of crime, mostly involving drugs and small-time thuggery. Like Spence, they weren't strangers to law enforcement. They were also vulnerable in the same way Spence was. They were poor, they were Hispanic in a mostly white power structure, and they weren't exactly pillars of the community. The Melendez brothers became the linchpins of the case, not because they were caught with evidence, but because they were the ones who eventually confessed. Quote, unquote. And let me put big quotation marks around that word. These confessions weren't the kind of airtight, factual retellings that revealed details only the killers would know. No, these were stories dragged out of them through long interrogations, promises, threats, and pressure. If you know anything about false confessions, you know they usually happen when someone feels trapped, hopeless, and believes saying what the police want will make things easier. Well, Gilbert and Tony fit that mold perfectly. And once they gave police a story, any story, it became gospel. But investigators wanted more than just violent thugs. They wanted a motive, a reason, some kind of narrative that could explain why 3 teenagers ended up dead at the lake. That's where Munir Deeb came in. Deeb was a Jordanian immigrant who owned a small convenience store in Waco. He was outspoken. He had a temper. He didn't fit neatly into the Waco community. He had reportedly argued with local teens before. To some he was abrasive, and to others he was simply different. And in a city like Waco in 1982, different could be enough to make you a target. The theory police built was almost absurd in its reach. They claimed Deeb had orchestrated the murders as part of a bizarre murder-for-hire plot. According to this version, Deeb wanted a girl killed who had supposedly rejected him, and Jill Montgomery looked like her. So he paid David Spence and the Melendez brothers to kill Jill, and the other 2 teens were collateral damage. I'll read that again. The official story was that a man paid 3 others to murder a teenager who resembled someone he didn't like. That was the state's motive. If it sounds flimsy, that's because it was. But flimsy can still hold up in a courtroom if you repeat it enough times. So here's how it came together. Police leaned on the Melendez brothers. After enough pressure, the Melendez brothers confessed. Their stories weren't consistent, but they all pointed to Spence. Well, that was good enough. Then, when the Melendez brothers' confessions, they tied in Spence. And with Spence implicated, they added Deeb as the mastermind. It was a domino line of logic. If the Melendez brothers were guilty, then Spence was guilty. And if Spence was guilty, then Deeb must have been behind it all. The problem? The evidence didn't back any of it up. There were no fingerprints, no hair, no fibers linking Spence, the Melendez brothers, or Deeb to the crime scene. None. The only connection was testimony from the brothers themselves and from a handful of jailhouse informants who claimed Spence bragged about the murders. Let's pause on that for a second. Jailhouse informants are notorious for saying whatever benefits them. Reduce sentences, drop charges, a little favor in exchange for a tall tale. In fact, wrongful conviction studies show that informant testimony is one of the leading causes of innocent people being convicted. But in Waco, in 1982, it was treated like gold. Now, the Melendez brothers' confessions were inconsistent. Sometimes they said one thing, sometimes another. They didn't always agree on details. They didn't provide unique knowledge that only the killers would know. Yet those confessions became the backbone of the prosecution. David Spence, for his part, maintained his innocence from the beginning. He admitted to being rough around the edges, yes, but he denied ever being at the lake, ever participating in the crime. And his defense pointed out correctly that there was no forensics evidence tying him to it. Deeb, too, denied everything. He insisted that the story was fabricated, that he was being targeted because of his outspokenness and his status as an outsider. And eventually, after years of appeals, Deeb's conviction would be overturned. But at the time, the narrative was too good to pass up. So why then? Why these suspects? Why did the police decide it had to be Spence, the Melendez brothers, and Deeb? Because they fit the story. They were outsiders. They had criminal records. They were people the community could believe might be guilty. And when you've got fear and outrage swirling, sometimes what matters isn't whether the suspects are the right ones. It's whether they're believable. And David Spence, he was very believable to people who already thought poorly of him. He wasn't polished. He wasn't respected. He was poor, Hispanic by marriage, and associated with people who had reputations. When he walked into a courtroom, he didn't look like a boy next door. He looked like someone you could imagine doing terrible things. And in trials, appearance often matters as much as evidence, sometimes more. By zeroing in on these four men, Spence, Gilbert, Tony, and Deeb, investigators gave the public what it wanted: suspects, arrests, a sense that the case was solved. But here's the question that lingers to this day. Was justice really served? Or did police, under enormous pressure, simply grab the nearest suspects and force the pieces to fit? Because if you strip away the confessions and the testimony of informants, with things to gain, what's left? No fingerprints, no murder weapon tied to them, no eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence, nothing tangible. Just stories. Stories told by scared men under pressure and repeated by prosecutors who needed convictions. And once the machinery of the justice system starts turning, once juries are seated and prosecutors thunder about monsters in closing arguments, it becomes very, very difficult to stop. For David Spence, the Melendez brothers, and Munir Deep, that machinery would change. And in some cases, their very lives. And for the families of Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene, it meant decades of never truly knowing whether the people convicted of the children's murders were the ones who actually committed them. If there's one phrase that sums up the Lake Waco investigation, it's this: a lot of smoke, very little fire. Investigators had suspects, yes. They had confessions, sure. They even had a motive so thin it would have been laughed out of a writer's room in Hollywood. But what they did have, the one thing you absolutely need in a murder case, was hard evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no definitively tied DNA to the crime, and yet somehow that absence didn't stop the wheels of justice from rolling forward. It just meant prosecutors had to dress up whispers and hunches in a suit and call it proof. Let's pause for a second and remember what year this was. 1982. Today, the crime scene at Spiegelville Park would have been a forensic gold mine. Every binding, every trace of skin under the victim's fingernails, every fiber would be analyzed, sequenced, and compared against national databases. But back then, forensics meant three things: blood typing, hair and fiber comparison, and fingerprints. That's it. And all three came up empty in Waco. The blood evidence was inconclusive. It matched too many possible people. The hairs weren't unique enough to tie to any one person. The fibers were generic, and the bindings, those torn strips of cloth, might as well have been pulled from any random laundry basket in McLennan County. So what did prosecutors do? They leaned hard on the only evidence they had: the confessions from the Melendez brothers and testimony from jailhouse informants. And let me tell you, building a case on jailhouse stitches is like building a house of cards during a tornado. Jailhouse testimonies, the shakiest. Over and over, prosecutors presented witnesses who claimed David Spence confessed to them in jail, that he bragged about stabbing the kids, that he described details of the crime, but when you looked closer, those details often didn't match the actual evidence. One informant swore Spence had described using electrical tape to bind the victims. Problem: no tape was ever found at the scene. Another claims Spence said he used a gun. Problem: there were no gunshot wounds. The inconsistencies were glaring, but in the courtroom, once the word is spoken, it's like throwing gasoline on the jury's imagination. And let's not ignore incentives here, okay? These informants weren't testifying out of the kindness of their hearts. They were doing it for deals. Lighter sentences, dropped charges, special treatment. You didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to see why they might be motivated to tell the state exactly what it wanted to hear. Despite this lack of visible evidence, the trials went forward. David Spence was tried separately, while the Melendez brothers and Deeb faced their own proceedings. In court, prosecutors treated Spence as a monster. They leaned heavily on his reputation. his rough background, his poverty, his association with people like the Melendez brothers. They argued he fit the role of the killer perfectly. And while his defense pointed out loudly that there was no forensic link, that didn't matter as much as you might hope. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Juries don't always convict on evidence. They convict on stories, and the story the state told of Spence and the Melendez brothers carrying out a depraved murder for hire plot, and for deed, was horrifying enough to sound believable, even if it made little logical sense. Think about it. A grown man, a store owner, supposedly fires 3 thugs to kill a girl because she looks like someone who annoyed it. That's the motive? Really? But when you put enough emotion behind a story, logic tends to take the back seat. And in Waco, a community desperate for closure, juries were ready to believe. David Spence was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Gilbert and Tony Melendez received life sentences. The alleged mastermind was also convicted, though his conviction would later be overturned. At the time, the community sighed in relief. Justice, they thought, had been served. Killers of Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene were off the streets. Parents could breathe easier. The headlines declared victory. A justice built on shaky foundations has a way of collapsing. Over the years, cracks began to show. Deep's conviction didn't survive appeal. Judges reviewing the case questioned the reliability of the evidence. Journalists began digging, pointing out the inconsistencies, the lack of physical proof, the questionable informant testimony. And Spence? He sat on death row, proclaiming his innocence to the end. He maintained he had nothing to do with the murders. His lawyers fought, argued, pleaded, but the appeal system is designed more to confirm convictions than to question them. In 1997, David Wayne Spence was executed by lethal injection. Many believe an innocent man died that night. Here's the haunting part. By the time DNA technology became available, much of the evidence from the Lake Waco case had been mishandled, lost, or destroyed. Opportunities to retest and find the truth were gone. We'll never know for certain whether biological evidence could have exonerated Spence or nailed the true killers. All we're left with are the doubts. And those doubts are heavy. Because in a case as brutal as this, where 3 teenagers were murdered so savagely, you'd hope the state would have built an unshakable case. Instead, they built one out of shadows and hearsay. And the consequence was not just 3 dead teenagers, but possibly innocent men executed in their names. That's the double tragedy at Lake Waco. The killers got away with murder once at the lake, and maybe again in court. By the late 1980s, Waco could officially say the Lake Waco case was solved. The Melendez brothers were behind bars, Munir Deeb had been tried, and David Spence sat on death row. On paper, the system had worked. The police had found the killers, the prosecutors had secured convictions, and the juries had done their duty. But ask around. Even then, and the story wasn't so easy. Beneath the surface, doubts bubbled, questions never stopped, and the more people learned, the more it seemed like the truth might have been buried alongside Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene. Just a few of the threads that were strung together. Let's start with what the state wanted everyone to believe. According to prosecutors, Munir Deeb, the convenience store owner, wanted Jill Montgomery dead. Not because Jill herself had done anything, but because she supposedly looked like another girl who had rejected him. So in this narrative, Deeb cooked up a bizarre plot. Hired David Spence and the Melendez brothers to kill Jill. The 3 thugs lured Jill, Kenneth, and Raylene out the lake, bound them, assaulted Jill, and stabbed all 3 to death. That's the official theory. Cold, cruel, senseless, and neat. But Meat's story aren't always true. This certainly had plot. The first problem, the motive was paper thin. People who knew Deeb said he had a temper, sure. But that's lawn from hiring people to kill a teenage girl because she looked like someone else? It sounded more like a bad TV script than a real-life plot. Second problem, the evidence didn't match. None of the forensic material, hair, fibers, blood, pointed to Spence, the Melendez brothers, or Deeb. Nothing tied them physically to the crime scene. The third problem, the confessions didn't hold water. The Melendez brothers contradicted themselves and each other. They got details wrong. They remembered facts that weren't consistent with what investigators have actually found. And yet, despite all the juries believed all of it. Why? Because the horror of the murders demanded a story. Once you have a story that feels satisfying, it's very hard to let it go. Now, some people believe the Waco murders weren't the result of a murder for hire plot at all, but rather a random act of violence. 3 teenagers out at night in a secluded park could have stumbled across the wrong people at the wrong time. The bindings, improvised plot, didn't suggest planning. The Frenching stabbing didn't suggest control. It felt chaotic, impulsive, brutal. In other words, exactly the kind of thing you might see from strangers, drifters, or opportunists. But if that were true, then the real killers walked away and were never caught. That's a chilling thought, and maybe that's why people preferred the Spinks version. Believing the killers were behind bars was easier than believing they were still out there. Another theory, there was someone else entirely. Journalists who dug into the case later uncovered rumors about other potential suspects, names that had circulated in Waco at the time but were never pursued with the same zeal. Some said the murders might have been connected to drug activity in the area. Others pointed to people with violent histories who were strangely overlooked. Still, others wondered if the crime had sexual motivations that didn't fit the neat murder for hire box the state had put. Every one of those theories had one thing in common. They were ignored. Once police locked on to Spence and the Melendez brothers, they did it and treated it like gospel. Here's the uncomfortable part. The Lake Waco suspects weren't chosen just because of evidence. They were chosen because they were believable villains. Spence was poor, rough, and had a record. The Melendez brothers were minorities with reputations. Deeb was a foreigner with an accent and a temper. In 1982, that cocktail was damning. It didn't matter that the evidence was thin. They looked guilty. They sounded guilty. And for a scared community, that was enough. Bias doesn't wear a badge or sit on the witness stand, but it can seep into every corner of a case, into who gets investigated, who gets believed, and who gets convicted. And in Waco, bias may have carried more weight than blood evidence ever could. When David Spence was executed in 1997, he went to the gurney maintaining his innocence. He admitted to being no angel, but he denied ever killing Kenneth, Jill, or Ray Lee. To the very end, he insisted the state had the wrong man. And here's what haunts people. If he was telling the truth, then Texans didn't just fail to find the real killers. Texas murdered an innocent fan in the name of justice. That possibility is why the Lake Waco case still sparks debate. Because the story doesn't end with justice served. It ends with a question mark. Now, why does all this still matter? Some people ask, why dig this up again? The case is decades old. The suspects were tried, convicted, punished. Well, here's why. Because if the state executed an innocent man, that's not history. That's a warning. If the system could fail in Waco in 1982, it can fail anywhere, anytime. And when it fails in a death penalty case, there's no going back. This is not a video game. We can't respawn. Theories and speculation swirl, not because people love to be serious, but because the truth was never nailed down. And when truth is left that loose, stories multiply. At the end of the day, 3 kids were murdered. Their families never got real closure, and the people convicted may or may not have been guilty. That's not justice. That's tragedy squared. For the families of Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene, the pain didn't stop with convictions. How could it? They weren't just burying their children, they were burying futures. College graduations that never happened, weddings that never came, holidays with empty chairs that served as constant reminders of what was lost. Their grief was private and endless, but it was also public. Every time the case was dragged back into court, appeals, retrials, Deep's overturned conviction, Spence's appeals, the families were asked to relive the nightmare. Sat in courtrooms and heard the details, repeated, dissected, doubted. Their children's names became headlines, their murders a spectacle. Some believed the state had gotten the right men, others weren't so sure. But for all of them, the only certainty was nothing could bring Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene back. Now, in the years after the convictions, journalists began digging deeper. Reporters like Michael Hall of Texas Monthly would write extensively about the case, pointing out inconsistencies, weak evidence, and the reliance on informants. Documentaries revisited the murders, interviewing former investigators, attorneys, and even some of the men convicted. The picture that emerged wasn't one of solid justice. It was one of desperation. Police had faced enormous pressure, and in that pressure they had zeroed in on suspects who fit a story, not necessarily the evidence. And once the machinery of the justice system began moving, it was nearly impossible to stop. Every doubt raised by journalists chipped away at the neatness of the state's version, and for many, the doubts became overwhelming. The most haunting moment in the aftermath came on April 3, 1997, when David Spence was executed by lethal injection. He went to the death chamber maintaining his innocence. His last words echoed the same claim he had made for years. He did not kill Kenneth, Jill, or Raylene. For supporters of the conviction, his execution was closure. For others, it's another tragedy layered on top of the first. Because if Spence was innocent, and many believe he was, then Texas had murdered an innocent man in the name of justice. And unlike a wrongful conviction, which can be overturned, an execution is final. There's no coming back, and no apology can undo it. What about the Melendez brothers? What about Deeb? Well, Gilbert and Tony Melendez lived out their lives in prison, their names forever tied to the Lake Waco murders. Whether they were guilty or not, their confessions under pressure sealed their fates. And Deeb, the alleged mastermind, he saw his conviction overturned on appeal. But by then, his name and reputation were ruined. He was a free man, but never truly free. To many, he would always be that guy from the Lake Waco case. And he died just 6 years after having his conviction overturned. For Waco itself, the murders left scars. The cities couldn't look at Lake Waco the same way again. What had once been a gathering place, a symbol of community, became a place of fear. Parents thought twice before letting their kids roam at night. The idea that 3 kids could be murdered in a public park shattered the illusion of safety. And the case became part of Waco's dark history, a chapter alongside other tragedies that would later pull the city into national headlines, from cult standoffs to school bus accidents. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Lake Waco murders isn't about Waco at all. It's about what the case says regarding justice in America. The Lake Waco case shows us how the vulnerable justice system can be to pressure, how confessions can be coerced, how jailhouse snitches can shape outcomes, how juries can be swayed by appearance and story rather than hard evidence. And it showed in the danger of the death penalty in cases built on shaky ground. Because if David Spitz was innocent, then his execution wasn't justice, it was state-sanctioned murder. I guess some things are just bigger in Texas. So why tell this story now, decades later? Because the questions never went away. Because the doubt still haunts. Because 3 kids, Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene, never got to grow up, and the people blamed for their murders may or may not have been responsible. And because cases like Lake Waco remind us that justice isn't automatic, it's fragile, it can be bent, twisted, even broken. And when it breaks in a case like this, the damage isn't just to the victims and their families. It's into the entire idea of fairness. The Lake Waco murders aren't just a story about 3 kids killed in a park. They're a story about what happens when fear overrides facts, when pressure dictates our outcomes, and when the truth is left behind in the rush for closure. Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene, 3 names, 3 teenagers who should have had decades of life. Instead, their lives ended violently on a summer night in 1982. David Spence went to his grave insisting he didn't kill them. Gilbert and Tony Melendez lived and died in prison. Munir Deeb had his conviction erased, but never his reputation. And the city of Waco has lived ever since with a case that feels less like resolution and more like a big, open, gaping wound. That's the legacy. Not certainty, not closure, but doubt. Question mark carved into history. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Because when we talk about justice, it's easy to believe the system always works, that the guilty are punished, the innocent are spared, and the truth comes out in the end. But in the Lake Waco murders, they show us the dark reality that sometimes the truth is messier. The guilty go free, sometimes the innocent die in prison or at the hands of the state. And sometimes, decades later, all we're left with is the grief of families, the doubts of journalists, and the echo of teenage laughter that should have never been silenced at all. As always, I'm your host, Doug Duncan, reminding you that once you enter the dark, you may never be the same.